Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Infinity Fast Forward webinar series. My name is Steve Kessler, and I'm going to host the program today. We've got a topic I think that we need to be talking about a little bit more than we generally do. Today, we're going to talk about workers' comp and the top 10 injuries that are associated with work comp in trucking. And, we talk an awful lot about insurance in the trucking business, but this is one that we don't talk about very much. And trucking is a dangerous business. So there are a lot of injuries, and we're very happy to have our guest on to talk about how we can help manage that risk. Couple of housekeeping things. Obviously, those of you that are logged in are muted, so we can't hear you. So if you want to communicate with us, you can type your question or comment in the chat box that you'll see there in the tray at the bottom. And also there's a Q&A box. So if you have a question, you can type it in either one of those places, and we'll try to take your questions probably toward the end of the presentation, and then we'll try to answer as many of those as we can. I also want to introduce to all of you our co-host, Mark Ray. Those of you that have been on our webinars this year and the last couple of years are familiar with Mark. Mark's a transportation executive, been at it 35 plus years. He's a certified director of safety, and he's on the board of several different organizations that all relate to safety. And Mark was a commissioned Army officer. So, Mark, what are your thoughts about the program today?
Well, I think this is a topic that does not get enough attention. We are all familiar with landing gears and hooking up airlines and getting in and out of a truck and work injuries that are in our industry, and they can reach out to the warehouse guys getting in and out of a trailer, getting the product, the freight into and out of a trailer can be a hazardous task to say the least. So content that Infinity has is available this afternoon to make your get some training out there to make these hazards more obvious to your staff. So really looking forward to Keith's presentation today. And work injuries are real, alive, and we need to address them.
Very good. Thanks, Mark. Well, let me introduce our guest, everyone. Our guest today is Keith Wirtz. Keith is the Vice President of Loss Control at Midwestern Insurance Alliance. Keith has a pretty long relationship with our company, by the way. Better than 30 years of experience in managing workers' compensation, risk, and insurance for various industries with strong emphasis on transportation, partial delivery, and wood products. Keith is a certified director of safety from North American Transportation Management Institute and has authored 2 books on workers' compensation and injury reduction. I should also say that Keith is a prolific content creator, and as a matter of fact, in our library of content, Keith has over 107 short videos that are called Real Life Lessons, which are great pieces of content that describe all kinds of places where injuries can happen: cargo securement and cleaning tractors and trailers and connecting glad hands and strapping and chaining freight and tarping and trailer landing gear and all those kind of things that you all know can cause problems. So without any further delay, Keith, I'm going to let you take it away.
Fantastic. I want to thank Vertical Alliance Group for inviting me to speak. So as Steve mentioned, I'm part of the loss control team at Midwestern Insurance Alliance. For those not familiar with Midwestern Insurance Alliance, we're a workers' comp provider with a very strong focus in the trucking industry. In addition to workers' compensation, Midwestern Insurance offers occupational accident coverage to independent contractors. Although Midwestern Insurance Alliance doesn't directly provide other lines of insurance, we are a proud part of the K2 insurance company family, which has a broad spectrum of insurance products for the trucking industry and other industries, as well as some personal lines insurance products.
Good.
So recently, we conducted a study of workers' comp claims in the trucking industry that spanned 2 years, 2022 and 2023. That study included approximately 1,300 trucking companies across the United States, and it'll be the basis for a lot of this webinar. It's my hope that you'll walk away from this webinar with a pretty solid understanding of the top sources of workers' comp claims in the trucking industry. It's also my goal that you'll learn some practical steps to address those sources of injuries. We'll also talk about conducting your own analysis of incidents and the importance of engaging your employees in getting them to help identify ways to prevent injuries. Lastly, we'll talk about workers' comp experience rating at a very high level. My goal with that is merely to make you understand how past actions or inactions related to safety management could be impacting what you're paying for workers' comp today. And I also want you to understand that what you're doing now can impact your premiums favorably for several years to come. I feel the need to also tell you what you won't get from this webinar. So you're not going to get answers to questions about what's compensable and what's not compensable as a workers' comp claim, or what the specific benefits are for different things. And one of the reasons for that is that I'm not a claims specialist. We have a staff of very knowledgeable claims folks that I rely on a lot to answer my questions relating to those things. But another reason is that workers' comp is not just one system. There's actually a different workers' comp system in each state. So each state has its own unique rules, its own requirements, its own benefit structure. And although there's significant similarities between state workers' comp systems, there's no two state workers' comp systems that are identical.
Interesting.
Before jumping in, I wanted to lay some groundwork because it's quite possible that some of the folks on this webinar have not dealt with workers' comp before or know very little about it. With very few exceptions, employers in the United States are required to have workers' comp coverage. In very broad terms, workers' compensation pays the medical expenses and the wage replacement benefits associated with work-related injuries and illnesses. Also, workers' comp provides disability and death benefits for work-related injuries. Another thing about workers' comp is that it is no-fault insurance. Also, workers' compensation is primary insurance, which means that it serves as the first source of coverage for work-related injuries or illnesses. If, for example, one of your drivers is injured in a crash on the job and another driver is at fault, workers' compensation will pay the medical expenses and the lost wage benefits, and then will subrogate against the at-fault party to recover what was spent. So, truth be told, there's not many insurance companies who are eager to write workers' compensation for a trucking company. And I wanted to talk just a little bit about why that is. There's several things that make trucking unique with respect to workers' comp. First, consider the workplace. For a manufacturer, a warehouse, a retail store, or most other businesses, the workplace is a fixed location. For those industries, the employer has total control over the workplace.
Yeah.
Not so for a trucking company. Most of your employees spend most of their time away from your facility. Their workplace is virtually limitless, and for the most part, you have absolutely no control over it. Although you might be able to compensate for it, you can't control the poor road design that created a traffic hazard. You can't control the ice on the sidewalk of a rest stop that caused your driver to slip and fall. And you can't control the inattentive driver who crosses the center line and runs into your truck. So another thing that makes workers' comp a challenge for trucking companies is that for most trucking companies, it's difficult to gather employees collectively for safety training. That's one of the reasons that Midwestern Insurance Alliance is a big fan of the Infinity platform and other online training platforms, because they help to solve that problem by providing training to drivers regardless of where they are. So what else makes a trucking company unique with respect to workers' compensation? Consider this fact. Most of your employees work without direct supervision almost all of the time. Hopefully your company is using telematics and dash cameras. If so, you can make up for the absence of direct supervision to some extent. However, that generally only applies to when the employee is behind the wheel. For the most part, you can't observe and correct employees who are outside of the truck cab, which is where most of the injuries occur. So if your drivers aren't using 3 points of contact while getting in and out of the truck cab, if they're spinning the landing gear with one finger, or if they're jumping out of the back of the trailer, chances are you're never going to know about it, at least not until it results in an injury.
Get an injury.
Not only that, the fact that they work without direct supervision also makes it hard to question the legitimacy of a workers' comp claim that you think might be questionable. For an employer in manufacturing, construction, retail, or other industries, lots of times there's witnesses that can either substantiate or refute what the injured employee says. You just don't often have that luxury in the trucking industry. Okay, so the bulk of your employees spend most of their time in a workplace that you have no control over. They can rarely get together for collective safety training, and they work without direct supervision almost all the time. On top of that, the Bureau of Labor Statistics says that the transportation industry is generally considered to have an incident rate that's higher than most other industries. Now, consider one of the statements that I made earlier about there not being just one workers' comp system, but 50 plus workers' compensation systems throughout the United States. Many trucking companies operate, at least to some extent, in all 48 contiguous states. It'd be nice if all the states followed the same rules, but they don't. Plus, jurisdictional lines can get blurry. And although that's not something that most other businesses have to worry about, it's a concern for most every trucking company. A lot of times a trucking company is located in one state, an injured driver lives in another state, and a workers' comp claim occurs in a third state. In that scenario, the truck driver, particularly if coached by an attorney, might petition to be covered by workers' compensation in the state that pays the highest benefits. But that's not it either. The trucking industry has an employee turnover rate that's higher than most other industries, and higher rates of employee turnover often correlate with higher rates of employee injuries. Lastly, consider the general health of the truck driver population as a whole. Not good, right? Whether it's the sedentary nature of the job, the lack of good truck stop food, a lack of personal responsibility, or the failure on the part of management to effectively promote health and wellness with drivers, truck drivers as a whole are not the picture of health. And as studies have shown, obese workers' comp claims are more likely to miss more days of work. They're likely to have higher medical costs, and they're more likely to become permanently disabled as a result of a work-related injury. You might even be able to add a few more things to that list about what makes workers' comp a unique challenge for trucking companies, but it's sufficient to say that handling workers' comp in trucking is harder than it is in most other industries. So normally when you see injury statistics, you'll see the injury categorized in a a few general ways. That might be by the body part affected, like the head or the ankle or the back. It might be by the type of injury, like a laceration or a strain or a fracture, or it might be by the mechanism of injury. In those cases, injuries are categorized by things like slips, trips, and falls, falls from elevations, or being struck by a falling or flying object. Each of those ways of categorizing injuries may be good for statisticians, but they have very limited value for safety directors who want more actionable information. So when Midwestern's loss control team meets with a particular company or we look at a particular industry, we tend to categorize claims based on what work task the employee was performing at the time that they were injured. And I'd suggest that you do the same if you want to categorize your company's injuries. In the study that I referenced a little bit earlier, we identified 50 specific work tasks in which employees of trucking companies were injured. We're not going to go through all 50 of them, but we will take a look at the top 10. So just a point of clarification here. When we're talking about the top sources of injuries in trucking, we're looking at the frequency of claims, not the cost of those claims, which is what we refer to as the severity. We do that because all too often the severity of an injury is determined by luck. And to illustrate what I'm talking about here, I want to share two actual injuries. In one claim, a driver missed a step getting out of his truck and he fell to the ground. He reported it to his employer, but he never sought any medical attention for it, and the claim had no loss, at least in terms of workers' compensation. In the other claim, a driver had the exact same incident. He was getting out of his truck, he missed a step, he fell to the ground. However, that claim incurred a loss of more than $300,000. The difference was largely due to luck, how those drivers hit the ground when they fell. So with that in mind, let's jump into the top 10 most frequent sources of workers' comp injuries. So let's start with the category in the top spot. With 21% of the workers' comp claims stemming from motor vehicle crashes, that was the single largest category of workers' comp claims from our study. At the risk of pointing out the obvious, if 21% of the workers' comp claims in the trucking industry stem from motor vehicle crashes, that means that nearly 80% do not. So if your safety efforts are focused almost exclusively on driving safety and DOT compliance, you're probably failing to address nearly 80% of your workers' comp claim exposure. Now, that said, I do want to point out something here. The average cost of a workers' comp claim from a motor vehicle crash in the trucking industry far exceeds the average cost of other claims. So based on our 2-year study of trucking companies, the average cost of a workers' compensation claim from a motor vehicle crash is $146,000. The average cost of other workers' compensation claims was $34,000. That's a big difference. Although I'm going to share the average claims cost for each of the categories that we'll discuss in this webinar, I want to make something clear. I work for a workers' comp provider. So when I'm referring to the incurred cost of a claim, I'm referring only to the direct costs, which is the amount that's been paid or the amount that's been held in reserves to be paid for that workers' comp claim. In many circumstances, that's just the tip of the iceberg for you. You need to consider the cost associated with the disruption to your business, hiring and training a replacement employee in some circumstances, the impact on morale that claims have, and a lot more. Now, I realize that this is barely skimming the surface on this topic, but in broad terms, we've listed a few strategies here related to preventing crashes. The first one that I listed here is be selective in hiring. If you choose the right people on the front end and avoid individuals who exhibit a pattern of at-risk behaviors, you're one step closer to preventing crashes. The second one listed here is maintain safe equipment. It's important to have an effective preventative maintenance program and to ensure that deficiencies are identified and corrected quickly. Next, and this is a big one, is leverage safety-related technology. If you haven't already, you need to find the safety technology that's best for you and deploy it. A lot of this webinar is about data and leveraging that data. The in-cab technology that's available to trucking companies today produces an incredible amount of data. And having access to that data and using it will make you a lot more effective than more effective than you could be if you weren't using it at all. And the last one listed here is coaching drivers. This goes hand in hand with leveraging technology. I still run into trucking companies that have data at their fingertips, data that will help them identify which drivers need coached, and they're not using it. So having data and not using it to your benefit has the same result as not having it at all. So I'll add one thing to this slide that I didn't include, and that is have a zero tolerance policy for seatbelt violations. There's really no excuse for a driver or passenger of a vehicle, let alone an 80,000-pound commercial vehicle, to not wear their seatbelt. So second on the list of top workers' comp claims in trucking is a very generic one that we simply refer to as walking. Of course, drivers walk to some degree every time they get out of their truck. The overwhelming majority of these injuries are slip, trip, and fall incidents in which the employee slipped or fell on ice, slipped on a slippery surface, tripped over an object, or they rolled their ankle on uneven ground. But injuries in this category also involves injuries such as stepping on a nail, having a foreign object blow into their eye while they're simply walking from point A to point B, or even being struck by a vehicle as they crossed a parking lot. In our study, injuries to drivers when they were merely walking from point A to point B represented 11% of the claims and had an average cost of $36,000. I think some of you'd be shocked to see that just how many of these claims involved employees slipping and falling on ice. One practical strategy to address those claims involves providing strap-on traction aids to employees who are likely to encounter icy conditions in their job. Another practical strategy is to share stories with your employees about incidents that happen to other drivers. The goal of doing that is to help your employees be more alert to these types of incidents as they go about their workday. In other words, creating top of mind awareness. So as Steve mentioned at the onset of this webinar, there's over 100 resources within Infinity's platform that use that strategy of creating top of mind awareness through stories about what happened to somebody else. So I would encourage you, if you are using the Infinity Workforce Solutions platform, to really take a look at those and to work those into your training schedule. Now, before we jump into the next one on the top 10 list, I wanted to encourage anybody on this webinar that, well, to use the chat feature or other features where you can share information on Zoom here to share other strategies. So if you've deployed a different strategy and different than the ones that we've mentioned in this webinar, go ahead and use the chat feature to share what you've done to address some of these things. And at the end of the webinar, we can share some of those things with everyone.
Great, good.
So a close third on the top 10 workers' comp claims is one that you might have guessed, and that's getting in and out of the truck cab. Most of the time, these incidents involve a driver falling, but not always. So sometimes the driver prevents a fall because they are using the handholds, but sometimes in those situations, they injure their shoulders in the process. Other times, drivers step down onto the ground and roll their ankle on uneven ground or something that they failed to see. In our study, injuries associated with getting in and out of the truck cab represented 9% of the workers' compensation claims, and the average cost was $36,000. Now, we've listed a few strategies here for addressing those incidents. One is simply using stickers on the truck or periodic reminders to keep this hazard top of mind. Another strategy involves training, ensuring that drivers know and use 3 points of contact and don't try to carry items while they're climbing in or out of the truck cab. The last one listed here is observation and feedback. That's more challenging if you have long-haul drivers, but each time they come into your terminal, it's another opportunity to see if they're putting into practice your training and then provide feedback. Number 4 on the top workers' comp claims in the trucking industry is loading and unloading freight. So in our categorization, this category does not include injuries from opening trailer doors or even load securement tasks. Instead, claims in this category are solely from handling the freight during the loading or unloading process, either manually or using a dolly or a pallet jack. In our study, injuries associated with handling freight represented 9% of the workers' comp claims and had an average claim cost of $37,000. If it's your policy that the freight that you haul is driver no touch, you may not necessarily be immune from these types of injuries. You might be surprised to see just how many of the claims in this category come from companies that haul driver no touch freight. So consider that if a driver arrives at a company facility and they're demanding that driver unload, or if your driver wants to unload or tailgate the freight to expedite the process and get back on the road quicker, if you don't have a clear and defined process for telling drivers what to do in those situations, that's probably a void that you want to fill. Also, if drivers use material handling aids, provide training to make sure that they know how to use it safely. So number 5 on the top list of workers' comp claims in the trucking industry is injuries while performing vehicle maintenance. This could include injuries to drivers as well as injuries to mechanics. Unfortunately, in some trucking companies, the sole focus of their formal safety efforts seems to be on drivers. If you have mechanics, you need to have safety management efforts focused on preventing mechanics from being injured as well. So in our study, injuries associated with performing vehicle maintenance represented 8% of the workers' comp claims and had an average cost of $17,000. One practical strategy is to have safety meetings at a routine frequency for shop employees. After all, these employees are much easier to gather together than drivers are. Another strategy is a safety-related recognition or incentive program for your maintenance employees. People often have very strong views about safety-related recognition or incentive programs, but if you have a program for your drivers, it makes sense to develop a separate one for your mechanics. Another strategy involves providing tools that make strenuous or difficult tasks less hazardous. That could be a tool that makes removing a stuck hub-piloted wheel easier, or a tool that makes it easier to handle brake drums, or a platform that makes it easier to access the engine compartment. Now, the last strategy listed on this screen is intentional and frequent observation and feedback. This is simply acknowledging mechanics when they're observed performing tasks safely and wearing proper PPE, and coaching them when they're not. Number 6 on the list of top workers' comp claims in the trucking industry has to do with injuries sustained while drivers are cranking the trailer landing gear. This includes injuries sustained by drivers who spin the landing gear or twirl it with one finger. In those circumstances, the crank handle can get away from them, and we often learn about those when the crank handle hits them in the hand or smacks them in the forehead. It involves injuries where loaded trailers are dropped too low and drivers strain while cranking the landing gear to raise it. It also involves injuries where there's internal damage to the worm gears inside the trailer landing gear, which makes it get in a bind when they're cranking it, and it kicks back. In our study, injuries associated with cranking landing gear represented 5% of the workers' comp claims and had an average claims cost of $24,000. So one strategy for addressing this type of injury is to provide hands-on training and orientation that addresses how to properly crank the landing gear. So for those of you on this webinar that use the Infinity Workforce Solutions platform, there's a good training video on there that Midwestern created in cooperation with the University of Kentucky called Cranking Trailer Landing Gear. So it should be pretty easy to find. Also, there's a number of products designed to minimize or eliminate exposure to injury associated with cranking the trailer landing gear. One's called the sixth wheel ratchet, which replaces the crank handle with a ratchet type mechanism. There's several out there that use an impact drill to raise or lower the landing gear. There's one called Easy Bar. That's a replacement crank handle that allows you to use two hands in a pedal type motion to raise and lower the trailer landing gear. So those are all some strategies that you could use to address that type of injury. So next on the top 10 list are workers' comp claims that we refer to as driving other than crash. Although we categorized injuries for this study based on the task that the employee was doing at the time that they were injured, it really didn't make any sense to lump workers' comp claims that stemmed from motor vehicle crashes with other sources of injuries that happened while the employee was driving. For that reason, this category of claims includes all injuries sustained while the employee was driving, except crashes. So these include drivers in the sleeper berth being thrown from the bunk when their co-driver put on the brakes hard. It also includes injuries from carbon monoxide leaking into the truck cab, or having the steering wheel jerk when the driver hits a big pothole. Other injuries in this category include back pain that the driver attributes to driving on rough road surfaces, or even heat stress when the truck AC is not working. And so in our study, injuries associated with these types of injuries, or these type of claims, represented 4% of the workers' comp claims and had an average cost of $31,000. One strategy to prevent these types of injuries is merely to ensure proper maintenance of the equipment inside the truck. So making sure the air ride seat is properly functioning, that the air conditioning is properly functioning, or even adding a CO detector in the truck cab. And if you're running with teams, another strategy is to adopt and enforce a sleeper berth restraint policy. Now, number 8 on the top 10 list of injuries sustained while a driver is opening or closing trailer doors. These include things like being struck by freight that's shifted in transit and falls out while the driver's opening the doors, but it also includes injuries in which the trailer door is blown by the wind and either strikes the employee or causes an arm or shoulder strain. Also, this category includes injuries where the latch on the trailer door is in a bind and it's difficult to unlatch. In our study, injuries associated with this type of incident represented 4% of the workers' comp claims, and the average cost was $18,000. With respect to protecting drivers from falling freight, one strategy is to provide drivers with a trailer strap that prevents the trailer door from flying open when it's unlatched if there's freight leaning up against the inside of the door. Another strategy is to provide hands-on training and orientation that addresses how to properly open and close trailer doors to avoid injury. And again, for those on this webinar that use the Infinity Workforce Solutions platform, there's a good training video that Midwestern Insurance Alliance has provided that addresses that topic.
And Keith, I think it also talks about making sure that door is secured if it's a windy day, something that the wind would blow the door over, and that could be a serious injury if that happened.
Absolutely. So number 9 is strapping or chaining freight. As you could reasonably assume, most of these injuries involve trucking companies that pull open deck trailers. Some of the injuries in this category involve strains or torn rotator cuffs from throwing chains or throwing a strap over a high load. They also include injuries in which the winch bar slipped out of the winch while the driver was tightening the load securement straps, or when a driver's struck by a winch bar or a chain binder that kicks back. So in our study, injuries associated with strapping or chaining freight represented 4% of the claims, and the average claims cost was $50,000. One practical strategy is to replace lever type chain binders with ratchet type or recoilless chain binders. Another strategy is to ensure that winch bars have a knurled end and a raised tip to help prevent them from slipping out of the winch. There's also ratchet type winch bars on the market that make the task of ratcheting winch straps safer. And yet another strategy is to train drivers how to throw straps in a manner that minimizes the risk of shoulder injury. Rounding out the top 10 list are injuries sustained while drivers are getting in and out of trailers. So include things like falls while getting in and out of the trailer, strains, knee injuries from jumping down out of a trailer, or stepping on an object or rolling an ankle while getting out of a trailer. So in our study, injuries associated with getting on or off a trailer represented 4% of the claims, and the average claims cost was $60,000. Certainly, the most effective strategy would be to eliminate the need for employees to enter or exit a trailer from the ground if you're able to do that. If you're not, minimizing it would be the next best strategy. Another strategy would be to provide portable ladders that fit into the rub rail of an open deck trailer or attached to the rear of a dry van or reefer trailer to make it easier for drivers to get in and out. You could also provide fixed handholds or additional steps to make it easier to get in and out of the trailer. And again, one more time, If you use Infinity Workforce Solution, there's a good training video in there that Midwestern made in cooperation with the University of Kentucky that addresses getting in and out of the back of a dry van or reefer trailer safely. So what we just discussed were injuries from 1,300 very different trucking companies. Many of the trucking companies in that study are similar to your company in some respects, but none of them is exactly like your company. So I hope that the things that we talked about so far gave you some insight. However, it's important that you conduct your own analysis to help you identify things to address in your company specifically. After all, unless there's been some dramatic change, your past employee injuries are the best indicator of what your future employees are going to be. So in conducting your own analysis, there's a number of different sources of information that you should gather. Of course, one of those things is your workers' comp loss runs and any supporting documents that you have on file for those workers' comp claims. That would include things like the state first report of injury form or any internal incident form that you have. Another source of information that you could gather to do your analysis is your OSHA 300 log. A lot of the entries on that form are going to be the same as on your workers' comp loss runs, but it's possible that there could be some entries on your OSHA log that are not workers' comp claims. You could also pull any near miss reports or incident reports that neither rose to the level of an OSHA recordable injury or a workers' comp claim. So I won't read through these, but this slide shows some of the things that would be helpful to include when you're analyzing incidents from for trends.
And I think, if you analyze the data, that's going to give you a good indication of where training needs to occur. It's going to make sure that you're focusing training that's going to provide the benefit that you're looking for. And
Absolutely.
not just trained to tick a box, so to speak. So
absolutely. So that is the whole goal of this of conducting your own analysis is to identify where to focus your efforts.
Exactly.
So although it's important to analyze your own company's data, it's also important to consider the quality of the data that you're using. I included a quote here that kind of sums it up. It says, good data leads to good decision. So in terms of incident data, what makes good data? First, it needs to be comprehensive. You need to have a process for capturing data from all incidents, whether they resulted in an injury or not. So if you don't have a process for employees reporting near miss events, it'd be a good idea to implement that. And if you have a process, but it's not resulting in any reports, you may need to dig in and understand why that is. Second, for data to be good, it also needs to be thorough. So you'll want to identify what data will be helpful, and you'll want to make sure that your forms solicit that information. Our team has met with a lot of trucking companies that document incidents using the state mandated first report of injury form, and they have no other internal way that they document incidents. That's their only form that they use. There's a couple problems with that. First, if the state reporting form is the sole form of internal documentation, I guarantee you those trucking companies aren't documenting any incidents unless they rise to the level of a workers' comp claim. Also, if a company is only using the state required first report of injury form, they're failing to capture a lot of meaningful information. There's so much more meaningful information that trucking companies need to gather about each incident that you're just not going to find anywhere on the state required first report of injury form. These include things like what at-risk conditions existed relative to the equipment or the environment at the time of the injury, or what at-risk behavior the employee was engaged in that contributed to the incident. So yes, you need to solicit thorough information, but for that data to be thorough, it also means that you hold your people accountable for completing those fields consistently. Doesn't make any doesn't serve your purpose if you have those fields on your internal form and they're not being filled out consistently. Which consistency is the next thing on the list here. When I'm mentioned that when I listed the consistency here, what I was referring to is that it's essential that you determine what information that you want to collect about each incident and ensure that that's done for every incident, whether the incident resulted in a serious injury, a minor injury, or no injury at all.
Makes great sense, because if you're not consistent with the information you're gathering, you're not going to be able to make good decisions, like your quote up there says, and it's going to be just hit or miss if you're training in the right areas. Just hitting, doing gathering your data just periodically is not going to give you a clear picture. In fact, it may give you a very skewed picture
Right.
of what's actually happening there.
Yeah. So I want to shift gears here a little and talk about getting your employees engaged. A lot of what I talked about so far has been focused on identifying areas to target, like Steve mentioned. Although that's important, data is just data unless we're using it for something. I think that is probably a natural tendency for many people in a safety management position to think that we have the answers because we have an education or we have experience doing that. Yeah. However, getting employees engaged in identifying solutions is really important. They're the ones engaged in the tasks. They're the ones exposed to the hazards, and it's their insights that they can often identify the best solutions. They might identify that we in a safety management position might not have ever thought about. So,
yeah, when you have engaged employees, you have a much better chance of creating that culture of safety within your company that a lot of people strive to. So people if you engage with them, safety will be more top of mind, I would say, most of the time.
Absolutely. Involving employees in identifying solution gives them that sense of ownership. Yeah. And that sense of ownership translates into employees internalizing those things and ultimately leads to safer behavior and fewer injuries.
There you go.
Unfortunately, I think this is an area where a lot of trucking company safety directors could improve. So when considering what controls to implement, it's important to understand what you see on this slide. For any injury exposure that you want to control, we should start at the top of this list and work our way down. And that's because the things at the top of this list are the most effective strategies. And as we work our way down through this list, they become increasingly less effective. At the top of this graphic is elimination. So elimination refers to removing the exposure. For example, making the decision to only transport freight that is driver no touch eliminates the exposure to drivers handling freight. Substitution refers to replacing a material or a process with a less hazardous one. For example, a flatbed hauler could substitute a conventional lever type chain binder with a ratchet type chain binder, which is a safer alternative. Engineering controls is the next one. That refers to things that we can do to prevent hazards from reaching employees. So one example of this for the trucking industry is provide mechanics with a tire inflation cage. Now, administrative controls towards the bottom there refers to providing employees with training, procedures, or warnings. So this includes any safety training that you do, or even things like putting fall hazard stickers on truck cabs. And then down at the very bottom is PPE. PPE, as you know, refers to things that are worn to protect workers. So one example of that might be requiring employees to wear bump caps when they're throwing load securement straps. Now, before we jump off this slide, I wanted to make a couple points. So first, there's absolutely nothing wrong with using a combination of these to control a hazard. Second, sometimes the solutions that we come up with could introduce new hazards, and we need to be careful not to do that. And lastly, sometimes it takes a while to implement long-term solutions, and in those circumstances, we need to consider some interim controls that we can implement quicker.
Very good. That's good advice.
So lastly, I wanted to talk very briefly and very broadly about experience rating and the impact that it can have. In the context of workers' compensation insurance, experience rating is the process of comparing your company's claims history with the average workers' comp claims history for your industry in your state. Although the actual calculations used by the National Council on Compensation Insurance or state rating bureaus is much more complicated, it's essentially actual losses divided by expected losses over a 3-year period. So in that formula, actual losses are the incurred losses from your company's claims over that period. And the expected losses are the amount that your company was expected to have based on all the other companies in your state and your industry. Now, admittedly, that is very much an oversimplification, but it at least provides an understanding of what the experience rating process is. What the experience rating process produces is the experience modification factor, which goes by a number of different names, XMOD, experience mod, or just mod, EMF. So goes by a number of names. But in a nutshell, if you have an experience mod of 1.0, that means that your workers' comp claims history is average for your industry. If you have an experience mod less than 1, that means that your claims history is better than average for your industry. And if your company has an experience mod greater than 1.0, that means that your claims history is worse than average for your industry. The important thing to remember is that the experience modification factor is used as a multiplier when calculating your workers' comp premiums. So that means if a company has an experience modification rating of 1.5, that'll bump their workers' comp premiums up by 50%. If they're unfortunate enough to have an experience modification factor of 2.0, that'll double their premium. But the reverse is true as well. I mean, if a company's experience modification factor is 0.75, that'll reduce their premium by 25%. So a couple very general things to remember about the experience rating process. First, it's calculated based on a 3-year period, which means that one bad year with respect to workers' comp claims is going to have less of a negative impact. It also means that one good year is not going to give you a favorable experience modification factor.
Works both ways.
Second, the calculation caps large claims. For example, if large claims in your state are capped at $100,000, and a workers' compensation claim exceeds $100,000, the amount in excess of that cap is either not factored into the calculation at all or significantly discounted in the calculation. So that means that having one very large claim is not likely going to make your experience modification factor skyrocket. And next, I want to talk about lost time claims. Lost time claims are weighted more heavily in the calculation than are medical only claims. With that in mind, that's one reason to explore the feasibility of modified duty, return to work, if it's at all possible, to bring your employees back to work, as long as that can be done within the physical restrictions imposed by the treating physician. One distinction to make here is that a lost time injury in the context of experience rating, it is an employee who misses work due to the injury that results in wage replacement benefits. In many states, wage replacement benefits don't kick in until anywhere between 3 and 7 days after the injury of the employee being off. So getting the employee back in that time, in that window, can keep a claim from being considered a lost time claim as it relates to experience rating. If you don't know your company's experience modification factor, find out what it is. If you have an experience modification factor significantly less than 1.0, you've had a relatively prolonged history of workers' comp claims that are more favorable than what you were expected to have. Congratulations. Keep up the good work.
Very good.
If your experience modification factor is significantly above 1.0, you've got some work to do to drive that down, and it's not going to happen overnight. So in terms of workers' compensation, trucking is considered a severity-driven industry. An individual trucking company may have relatively few claims, but the potential for a severe workers' comp claim is greater than it is in many other industries. So that said, you may have very few incidents to create your own claims analysis. If that's the case, I hope that the information from the study that we did was helpful in identifying some of the key sources of workers' comp claims in the trucking industry as a whole. But regardless of the size of your company or the number of workers' comp claims that you've had in recent years, I'd encourage you to take a good hard look at your process for collecting data. I'd encourage you to implement a near miss reporting process if you don't have one, and to analyze your own company's incident data to identify areas that you should target. I'd also encourage you to take an honest look at your process for engaging employees in the process of identifying hazard controls, and then implement those controls based on that hierarchy of controls graphic that we looked at earlier. Lastly, I'd like to encourage you to take a look at your experience modification factor, understand what got you where you are and what you can do to drive that number down. I thank you very much.
That's fantastic, Keith. That's some really outstanding information, a whole lot of things that I was not aware of. So I really appreciate the information you provided in the study that you all have completed to share this with us. There's one question here from Kevin, and I think maybe you might have sort of touched on it there at the end. He's asking, at what level do you determine a minor or major incident? Is that from dollar amount or some other way that's judged?
I guess that would all depend on the individual company. I mean, for calculation of the experience mod, that's determined at the state level. I think most states are around that $100,000 mark for what's severe. But I mean, the average cost of a workers' comp claim I had mentioned earlier, I think was $34,000.
Right.
So apart from the ones that are motor vehicle crashes, so anything higher than that would be above average, and you could internally determine that to be you know a major incident.
Okay. One question that I had, and you sort of addressed it early in your presentation. There are obviously indirect costs associated with work comp injuries. And I have understood that often those indirect costs can be more than what the insurance is obligated to pay for. I was wondering if you could expand on that just a little bit.
Yeah. So the federal OSHA website has a calculator that they call safety pays.
Okay.
So employers could go in there and determine in broad terms what the ultimate cost of an injury is. Like I mentioned earlier, when we're looking at an injury, the cost of the claim is what is the cost of the claim for us. So
Right.
There's quite a number of different factors that would need to be considered when calculating the ultimate cost of the claim. So that safety pays calculator might be helpful in that regard.
That's great. Keith, one last thing real quickly. I read recently that there are more injuries for new employees. They have more accidents in the first 12 months of employment than more sustained employees or long-term. Is that information you're aware of, or is that typical, or is that an outlier article
Yeah.
I looked
So
at?
so that is typically true for any industry, and trucking is no exception. Um, another thing that I did not pull into the presentation is the cost of the claim is generally higher as the employee increases in age, and that is um, likely due to comorbidities and just the fact that the older we are, the longer it takes to heal.
Makes perfect sense. Keith, I think we've kind of run through our hour here today, but special thanks to you for joining us. This is great information, and I think we'd really like to make sure we kind of update this from time to time. So look to have you back on a program like this in the future, or certainly if anything else pops up. Mark, thank you for joining us today, and thanks to all of you all out there that sat in on our webinar today. Keith, I don't know if you can see the chat, but there are all kinds of thank yous popping in, and I'll send you the list so you can see who all was out there. And but tremendous information, and I think it's something we all just need to think about. And one of the things that just popped into my head, the trucking industry has been a little tough lately, and profitability has been an issue. And when you're thinking about insurance and ways you can reduce claims and the costs associated with them, can add money to the bottom line of the company. So
Absolutely.
safety can impact profitability significantly.
Absolutely.
Very good. Keith,
Yes,
thank you,
and
sir.
four out of 5 of those injuries are not crash related.
Yeah,
Right.
that's very true.
Absolutely.
Keith, thank you, sir. Thanks to everybody that joined us, and look forward to getting an invite on our next webinar. Keith, thank you, sir. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you all.
Thank
Very
you,
good.
Keith.
Thanks, everyone.